The desert wind howled across the Mojave training grounds with the fury of a wounded beast, carrying with it the acrid smell of sagebrush and the metallic tang of spent ammunition. Sergeant First Class Maria Esperanza Santos lay motionless behind. Her Barrett M82A1, her breathing synchronized with the rhythm of the gusts that threatened to throw her shot 3 feet off target at this distance. 4,500 meters. Nearly 3 miles of hostile terrain stretched between her position on the ridge and the target downrange, a playing card. The ace of spades, pinned to a weathered wooden post. Creating this incredible story takes serious time and effort, so if you're enjoying it, please hit that like button, share with friends, and don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun painted the landscape in harsh oranges and deep purples, casting long shadows that danced with each gust of wind. Maria's dark eyes, steady as granite, tracked the wind patterns through her scope. 22-knot crosswinds from the southwest, gusting to 35. The kind of conditions that would make most snipers pack up their gear and wait for a calmer day. But today wasn't most days. Santos, Colonel James Hawthorne's voice crackled through her earpiece, carrying 28 years of military authority and barely concealed skepticism. I've seen a lot of impossible things in my time, but what you're proposing ... He paused, and Maria could picture him shaking his graying head, the same way he had when she'd first requested permission for this demonstration. Hell, girl, the best shooters in the world struggle to hit a man-sized target at that range in perfect conditions. You're talking about splitting a bullet on a razor blade attached to that card, in these winds. Maria's fingers traced the familiar grooves of her rifle stock. A custom piece she'd named Esperanza, hope after her grandmother who had taught her that impossible was just another word for hasn't happened yet. The weapon had been her constant companion through 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and countless training, exercises that had earned her a reputation as the most accurate long-range shooter in the entire U.S. Army. Sir, Maria's voice was calm, barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the radio with crystalline clarity. With respect, I've been studying these wind patterns for 6 months. I've calculated every variable: barometric pressure, humidity, temperature gradients, Coriolis effect. The conditions right now, in the next 12 minutes, will create a window. A brief one. Behind her, Staff Sergeant Chen adjusted his spotting scope, his weathered face creased with concentration. At 42, Chen had been Maria's spotter for the past 4 years, and he understood her shooting better than anyone alive. His fingers danced across his range card, making minute adjustments to his calculations. "Wind's shifting, Maria," he murmured, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "Southwest holding at 24 knots, but I'm seeing a thermal column building. Give it 3 minutes and we'll have our window." The third member of their team, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, stood 20 meters back with a high-speed camera capable of capturing 10,000 frames per second. At 26, Mitchell was young for an officer, but her background in ballistics physics had made her invaluable to the Special Operations Command's Advanced Marksmanship program. Her green eyes were fixed on the digital readout streaming across her tablet: wind speed, direction, temperature, humidity, all feeding into the complex algorithms she'd spent 2 years developing. "The math checks out," Mitchell called over the wind, her voice tight with excitement and nerves. "But Maria, the margin for error is less than half a millimeter. The slightest miscalculation, a single degree of barrel movement." "I know, Maria," replied, her voice carrying the confidence that seemed to settle the very air around them. She'd been preparing for this shot not just for months, but for her entire life. Every competition she'd won as a teenager in New Mexico, every enemy combatant she'd neutralized in the mountains of Afghanistan, every hour spent in meditation, learning to control her heartbeat and breathing, it had all led to this moment. Target downrange wasn't just any playing card. The ace of spades had been specially prepared with a razor blade, just 0.3 millimeters thick, attached perpendicular to its surface. The blade itself was positioned at the exact center of the card, creating a target no wider than a human hair when viewed from this distance. The challenge wasn't simply to hit the card. It was to strike the razor blade with such precision that her bullet would split in half, creating two distinct impact points on either side of the blade. Colonel Hawthorne had called it a publicity stunt when Maria first proposed it. The Army's recruiting numbers were down, and the brass was looking for something spectacular to capture the public imagination. But for Maria, this was about more than publicity. It was about proving that the limits others accepted weren't limits at all. They were simply boundaries waiting to be crossed. The wind monitor in Lieutenant Mitchell's hand began beeping softly. "Thermal's building," she announced, her voice rising slightly. Crosswind dropping to 18 knots and steadying. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the wind patterns across her face, reading the desert the way her grandmother had taught her to read the high plains of New Mexico during their hunting trips together. Abuela Santos had been a woman. A few words but infinite wisdom, and her ghost seemed to whisper in the wind now. "Mia, the rifle doesn't make the shot. The heart does." Range confirmed at 4,517 meters, Chen reported, his voice steady as bedrock. Elevation adjustment 7.3 mils up, WINDA G. He paused, recalculating as a fresh gust swept across the range. 2.8 mils right to start, but you'll need to adjust as the thermal develops. Maria's breathing slowed, each inhalation and exhalation becoming deeper, more controlled. Her heart rate, which she'd trained to remain below 50 beats per minute during shooting, settled into its familiar rhythm. Through her scope, the target seemed impossibly small, a mere speck against the desert backdrop. The razor blade was invisible at this distance, its presence known only through careful measurement and unwavering faith in the mathematics that had brought her to this moment. 60 seconds until optimal conditions, Mitchell announced, her voice barely audible over the wind. The pressure was immense. Word of this attempt had spread through the military community like wildfire. Generals were watching. The media had been invited. This wasn't just about Maria Santos anymore. It was about pushing the boundaries of what was possible. About proving that human potential, when combined with dedication and perfect preparation, could achieve the impossible. But as Maria settled into her final shooting position, feeling the familiar weight of her rifle, sensing the rhythm of the wind, she felt a strange calmness descend over her. This wasn't about the audience. It wasn't about the publicity. It wasn't even about proving the colonel wrong. This was about a promise she'd made to herself years ago, lying in a hospital bed in Germany with shrapnel wounds in her shoulder and the fear that she might never shoot again. The promise was simple. She would never accept limitations that others tried to impose on her. 30 seconds. Mitchell's voice carried a tremor of anticipation. Maria's finger found the trigger, not touching it yet, but familiarizing herself with its familiar curve. She'd fired this rifle over 10,000 times, and she could predict its recoil, its behavior, its personality as intimately as she knew her own reflection. The custom trigger had been set to break at exactly 1 pound 12 ounces light. Enough for precision, heavy enough to prevent accidental discharge. Through her scope, she could see heat shimmer beginning to rise from the desert floor as the thermal column Lieutenant Mitchell had predicted started to develop. This was the key to the entire shot. The thermal would create a brief corridor of more stable air, a pathway through the chaotic crosswinds that would allow her bullet to maintain its trajectory. 15 seconds, Mitchell called out. Thermal column fully developed. Wind at the Fay. Target dropping to 12 knots and steadying. Maria's world contracted to nothing but the crosshairs in her scope, the gentle pressure of the trigger against her finger, and the rhythm of her own breathing. She could feel her pulse in her temples. Slow and steady. Behind her closed eyelids, She visualized the bullet's path, the initial muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, the gradual deceleration due to air resistance, the subtle curve as the Coriolis effect influenced its trajectory, and finally, the moment of impact when lead would meet steel. 5 seconds, Mitchell whispered. 4.3.2.1. Optimal conditions now. Maria's finger applied pressure to the trigger, smooth and steady. The rifle's firing pin struck, the primer with a sharp crack that echoed across the desert. The .50 caliber bullet erupted from the muzzle at nearly 3 times the speed of sound, its brass casing ejecting in a golden arc that caught the morning sunlight. For 2.3 seconds, the bullet traveled through the desert air, following a trajectory that had been calculated to the nearest tenth of an inch. Through her scope, Maria watched, her breathing suspended, as the speck that represented her target waited in the distance. The impact, when it came, was visible only as the briefest glint of reflected sunlight off the spinning fragments of lead. But Lieutenant Mitchell's high-speed camera caught what the human eye could not. A single bullet striking a razor blade and splitting into 2 perfect halves, each piece continuing its journey to strike the wooden post on either side of the ace of spades. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire desert, broken only by the whisper of wind through sagebrush and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Colonel Hawthorne's voice, when it finally came through the radio, was barely recognizable. "Jesus Christ, Santos. You actually did it." But Maria Santos was already setting down her rifle, her dark eyes fixed on the horizon where heat waves danced like spirits in the morning light. She had proven something today, not just to the colonel, or to the watching generals, or to the cameras that would broadcast this moment around the world. She had proven it to herself. The impossible was simply another word for what hadn't happened yet. 6 hours before that impossible shot, Maria Santos had been sitting in the pre-dawn darkness of her small apartment on base, staring at a photograph that had traveled with her through every deployment, every training exercise, every moment of doubt in her 12-year military career. The image showed a younger version of herself standing beside her grandmother on the porch of their family ranch in Las Cruces, New Mexico, both of them holding rifles and wearing matching grins after a successful deer hunt. ERANZA. Santos had been 93 when that photo was taken, her back still straight, her eyes still sharp, her hands still steady enough to thread a needle without glasses. She had died 3 months later, but not before teaching her granddaughter the most important lesson of her life. "Mia, they will tell you what you cannot do because they cannot imagine doing it themselves. But the only voice that matters is the one that whispers in your heart when the world is quiet." Maria's morning routine was as precise as her shooting. 5 a.m. wake-up, 20 minutes of meditation sitting cross-legged on her narrow bed, followed by exactly 45 minutes of physical training. Her apartment was spartanly furnished: a bed, a desk, a bookshelf filled with ballistics manuals and poetry collections, and a gun safe that held her most precious possessions. The walls were bare except for 3 items: the photograph of her grandmother, her Army Marksmanship Unit certificate, and a letter from a young Afghan girl named Layla, whose life Maria had saved during her second tour. The letter, written in careful English and delivered through a Red Cross worker, read, "Dear American Sniper Lady, I am now in school because the bad man who said girls cannot learn is gone. My teacher says I am very smart with mathematics. I think about you every day and wonder if you are safe. Thank you for making it possible for me to dream." These 3 items represented the foundation of Maria's identity, family legacy, professional excellence, and the weight of responsibility that came with the power to change lives at impossible distances. But this morning, as she prepared for the shot that would define her career, she felt the familiar stirring of doubt that had plagued her since childhood. Growing up in Las Cruces, Maria had been the girl who preferred books to dolls, who spent summers working cattle alongside her father and uncles who could outshoot boys twice her size at county fairs and never seemed to fit the mold that others expected her to fill. Her father, Roberto Santos, had been proud but worried. "Mia," he would say, watching her disassemble and clean her .22 caliber rifle with the patience of a master craftsman. "The world is hard enough for women without choosing the hardest path of all." Her mother, Elena, had been more direct. "Why must you always prove something? Why can't you just be normal?" Normal. The word had followed Maria through high school, where she'd graduated valedictorian while also winning the state championship in precision shooting. It had followed her to college, where she'd studied engineering while continuing to compete nationally. And it had followed her to the recruiting station where, at 22, she'd made the decision that would define her life. The recruiting sergeant, a weathered man named Davis, had looked at her test scores and shaken his head. "You could be an officer," he'd said. "Intelligence, logistics, military police. Why do you want infantry? Why do you want to be a sniper?" Maria's answer then had been simpler than her answer would be now. "Because I can." But 12 years of military service had taught her that "because I can" wasn't enough. She had learned to read the unspoken questions in people's eyes. Can a woman handle the psychological pressure of taking a life at distance? Can she carry the weight of equipment through hostile terrain? Can she maintain focus during the chaos of combat? The answers had come in the mountains of Afghanistan, where Maria had spent 8 months as part of a forward reconnaissance team. Her first confirmed kill had been a Taliban sniper who had been terrorizing a village near Kandahar, picking off children who dared to attend the school that coalition forces had helped establish. Maria had tracked him for 6 days, studying his patterns, learning his habits, waiting for the perfect shot. When the moment came, she had felt no satisfaction, only a quiet certainty that she had done what was necessary. The Taliban sniper's death had meant that 37 children could continue their education without fear. It had meant that teachers could walk to school without scanning rooftops for the glint of rifle scopes. It had meant that progress could continue, but late at night, lying in her bunk listening to the distant rumble of mortar and the whispered prayers of fellow soldiers, Maria had wondered if her grandmother's lesson about ignoring the voices of others had prepared her for the voice of her own conscience. Her personal life had been a series of carefully managed compromises. Relationships had been difficult, not because Maria couldn't love, but because she couldn't fully explain the part of herself that found peace only behind a rifle scope, studying ballistics tables, calculating the complex mathematics that turned intention into action across impossible distances. She had dated fellow soldiers who understood the military life, but struggled with the intensity of her dedication. She had dated civilians who appreciated her intelligence and humor, but could never quite grasp why she chose to spend her leave time on shooting ranges instead of beaches. 3 years ago, she had thought she'd found someone who understood. Captain Michael Torres had been a fellow marksman, someone who shared her passion for precision and her dedication to excellence. For 8 months, their relationship had been built on mutual respect, shared goals, and the kind of deep understanding that only came from truly knowing another person's craft. But Torres had also been ambitious. And when a promotion opportunity arose that required him to recommend against Maria for a special operations position, he had chosen his career over their relationship. "You're too focused," he had said during their final conversation. "You can't see beyond the next shot, the next competition, the next impossible challenge. There's a whole world out there, Maria, but you only see it through a rifle scope." His words had stung not because they were cruel, but because they contained a grain of truth. Maria did see the world differently than most people. Where others saw limitations, she saw variables to be calculated. Where others saw impossibility, she saw problems waiting to be solved. This perspective had made her the most accurate sniper in the Army, But it had also made her lonely in ways she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. The morning of the impossible shot, Maria had awakened from a dream about her grandmother. In the dream, they had been hunting together in the high desert of New Mexico, tracking an elk through terrain that seemed to shift and change with each step. "Mia," her grandmother had said, raising her rifle to point at a target that remained forever just out of sight. "What you hunt is not what you think you hunt." Maria had awakened, with those words echoing in her mind, and as she prepared for the day that would define her career, she found herself wondering what exactly she was hunting. The answer, she realized, had changed over the years. As a child, she had hunted for approval, the nod of respect from her father, the grudging acknowledgement from boys who couldn't match her accuracy. As a young soldier, she had hunted for excellence, the perfect score, the impossible shot, the record that couldn't be broken. In combat, she had hunted justice, protecting the innocent by eliminating those who would harm them. But now, sitting in her apartment as dawn approached and the most challenging shot of her life awaited, Maria understood that what she really hunted was something more elusive, the moment when potential became reality, when the impossible transformed into the inevitable. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Lieutenant Mitchell. "Media's arriving. CNN, Fox, ESPN. This is going to be bigger than we thought." Maria set the phone aside without responding. The media attention, the publicity, the potential fame, none of that mattered. What mattered was the shot. What mattered was proving, once again, that the boundaries others accepted as immutable were simply challenges waiting for the right person with the right preparation and the right moment. She stood and walked to her gun safe, entering the combination that corresponded to her grandmother's birthday. Inside, Esperanza waited, the custom Barrett M82, a one that had been her companion through countless challenges. The rifle's stock bore small inscriptions, meaningful only to Maria. Coordinates of successful shots, dates of fallen comrades, the mathematical formula for calculating bullet drop at extreme range. As she lifted the rifle from its case, Maria felt the familiar surge of calm that came with holding this particular weapon. Esperanza wasn't just a tool, she was an extension of Maria's will, a precision instrument that had been modified and refined until it responded to her intentions as naturally as her own limbs. The walk to the armory was conducted in pre-dawn silence, her boots echoing off empty corridors as base began to wake around her. Other soldiers, early risers preparing for PT, nodded respectfully as she passed. Word of today's attempt had spread through unofficial channels, and Maria could feel their expectations following her like shadows. In the armory, she methodically prepared her equipment. Each bullet was weighed to ensure consistency. Each component of her rifle was inspected and tested. The scope was calibrated and recalibrated. Nothing was left to chance, because at 4,500 meters, chance was the enemy. Staff Sergeant Chen arrived. As Maria was conducting her final equipment check, his own gear bag slung over his shoulder. At 42, Chen moved with the economy of motion that came from 2 decades of military service, most of it spent behind spotting scopes, calculating wind speed and range for other people's shots. "How you feeling?" he asked, setting his bag down and beginning his own preparation ritual. "Like my grandmother is watching," Maria replied, and Chen nodded as if this made perfect sense. They had worked together long enough that conversation was often unnecessary. Chen understood the weight of what Maria was attempting, understood that this shot would either elevate her to legendary status or become a very public failure that would overshadow every success she had achieved. Lieutenant Mitchell arrived 30 minutes later, her arms full of electronic equipment and her face bright with excitement. At 26, Mitchell still possessed the enthusiasm of youth, the belief that science and mathematics could solve any problem. She reminded Maria of herself at that age, though Maria had never possessed Mitchell's easy confidence in the face of impossible challenges. "The weather station confirms our predictions," Mitchell announced, setting up her monitoring equipment. "Thermal column should develop right on schedule. Wind patterns are holding steady. Barometric pressure is optimal." Maria nodded, but her attention was focused inward, on the process of mental preparation that was as important as any physical equipment. She had learned meditation from a Buddhist monk during her rehabilitation after her shoulder injury, and the techniques had proven invaluable in achieving the mental clarity required for extreme range shooting. As the three of them loaded their equipment into the transport vehicle that would carry them to the shooting position, Maria felt the familiar transformation beginning. The woman who worried about relationships and media, attention and career consequences was gradually being replaced by the sniper who existed only in the moment of the shot, who saw the world as a series of variables to be calculated and obstacles to be overcome. The drive to the shooting position took 45 minutes, following dirt roads through desert terrain that reminded Maria of her childhood home. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful if she had allowed herself to notice. But her attention was focused on the wind patterns she could see in the movement of sagebrush and dust, on the way heat shimmer would develop as the day warmed, on the thousand small details that would determine success or failure. By the time they reached the shooting position, Maria Santos, the woman, had essentially disappeared, replaced by something more focused, more precise, more dangerous. The transformation was complete when she lifted Esperanza from the transport and felt the rifle settle into her hands like a missing piece of herself finally returned. Colonel Hawthorne was waiting at the position, along with a collection of observers. That made Maria's stomach tighten with nerves she refused to acknowledge. Generals, journalists, cameras, measuring equipment, all of it focused on her and the shot she had promised to make. "You ready for this, Santos?" the colonel asked, his voice carrying decades of authority and a hint of genuine concern. Maria looked downrange toward the target that waited 4,500 meters away, invisible to the naked eye but present in her mind as clearly as if it were inches from her face. She thought about her grandmother's words about the voices of others, about the Afghan girl whose life had been changed by accurate shooting, about the difference between what was possible and what was impossible. "Yes, sir," she replied, and for the first time in months, she felt completely certain of something. The impossible shot was waiting. The tension on the shooting range was palpable as word spread through military channels about Maria's impossible shot attempt. What had begun as a simple training exercise had evolved into something much larger, a test not just of marksmanship, but of the limits of human capability itself. By 0800 hours, the observation area behind the shooting position had filled with faces that Maria recognized from briefings, award ceremonies, and late-night war stories shared in forward operating bases across 2 continents. General Patricia Whitman, the first female commander of the Army Marksmanship Unit, stood with her, arms crossed, her steel-gray eyes fixed on the target downrange. At 58, Whitman had broken barriers throughout her career, but she had never attempted anything as audacious as what Maria was proposing. Her presence added weight to the moment. This wasn't just about one soldier's ambition anymore. It was about proving that the Army's investment in advanced marksmanship training could produce results that bordered on the miraculous. "Santos," the general approached as Maria was making final adjustments to her rifle scope. "I want you to understand what's at stake here. We've got CNN setting up cameras. The Pentagon is watching. If you miss..." She paused, studying Maria's face for any sign of doubt. "If you miss, every critic who's ever questioned women in combat roles will point to this moment as proof that we're pushing too hard, too fast." Maria's hands never stopped working as the general spoke, her fingers moving with practiced precision across the rifle's controls. "With respect, ma'am, I'm not shooting for the critics. I'm shooting because it's possible. And if you're wrong..." "Maria." finally looked up from her rifle, meeting the general's gaze with steady confidence. Then I'll learn something valuable about the difference between possible and probable. 20 meters away, a cluster of media representatives had gathered around Lieutenant Mitchell, their questions coming rapid fire as she explained the technical aspects of the shot. The target is a standard playing card, the ace of spades with a razor blade attached perpendicular to its surface, Mitchell was saying, her voice carrying over the desert wind. The blade is positioned at the exact center of the card. Sergeant Santos must strike the blade with sufficient precision that her bullet splits into 2 equal halves. What's the mathematical probability of success? Asked a reporter from ESPN, her camera operator adjusting his angle to capture both Mitchell and the distant target. Mitchell paused, consulting the tablet that contained her calculations. Under perfect conditions with no wind, optimal temperature, and a completely stable shooting platform, the probability would be approximately 1 in 800. Given today's conditions, crosswinds of 20 to 35 knots, thermal variables, and the extreme range, I'd estimate closer to 1 in 1500. The reporters scribbled notes frantically. A shot with odds of 1500 to 1 wasn't just news, it was the kind of story that would capture public imagination and generate millions of views across social media platforms. But the media attention was creating its own problems. Major Rick Harrison, the range safety officer, had been receiving calls from his superiors every 15 minutes since sunrise. The last conversation had been particularly heated. Harrison, Colonel Hawthorne, pulled the major aside, his voice tight with stress. I just got off the phone with Division Command. They're worried about the publicity if this goes wrong. They want to know if we can postpone until conditions are more favorable. Harrison, a veteran of 3 combat tours and countless training exercises, shook his head firmly. Sir, Sergeant Santos has been studying these conditions for months. She's identified a specific window of opportunity based on thermal patterns that won't repeat for weeks, maybe months. If we postpone, we're essentially admitting the shot is impossible. The politics of the situation were becoming clearer by the hour. Success would bring glory to the Army's marksmanship programs, validation of advanced training techniques, and a recruiting coup that could inspire a generation of young shooters. Failure would raise questions about resource allocation, the wisdom of attempting public demonstrations of extreme difficulty, and the pressure being placed on individual soldiers to perform miracles. Sergeant First Class Carlos Mendoza, one of Maria's former students and now a member of the Army Marksmanship Unit's advanced training cadre, approached her position with obvious concern. Maria, he said quietly, using her first name in a breach of protocol that indicated the depth of his worry. The pressure's building. Half the people here are hoping you succeed, and the other half are probably hoping you fail so they can say they knew it was impossible all along. Maria glanced at the observation area, where clusters of uniformed observers stood in small groups, their conversations animated and their body language revealing their various allegiances. She could identify the supporters, fellow snipers, soldiers who had worked with her, officers who believed in pushing the boundaries of what was possible. But she could also identify the skeptics, traditionalists who viewed this demonstration as a dangerous stunt, bureaucrats who were already calculating the political fallout from a missed shot. Carlos, Maria said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had made her one of the most respected instructors in the program. What did I teach you about external pressure? Mendoza smiled despite his concerns. That the only pressure that matters is the pressure on the trigger. Exactly. But even as Maria projected confidence, she was acutely aware of the weight of expectations. Staff Sergeant Chen, observing the growing crowd through his spotting scope, had identified additional complications. Maria, Chen's voice carried a note of urgency as he pointed toward a cluster of vehicles arriving at the range entrance. We've got company. That's a transport from the Pentagon. Through the heat, shimmer, and dust, Maria could make out military vehicles disgorging passengers in dress uniforms. The arrival of Pentagon officials transformed the already high-stakes demonstration into something approaching a military spectacle. These weren't just observers. They were decision-makers whose opinions would influence funding, training programs, and the future direction of military marksmanship. Colonel Hawthorne's radio crackled with increased traffic as range security worked to manage the growing crowd. All stations, be advised we have VIP arrivals. Maintain security protocols and ensure all personnel remain behind the safety line. The safety line itself had become a point of contention. Originally set at 500 meters behind the shooting position, it had been moved back twice as the crowd grew. Military police had been called in to manage access, and the simple training exercise that Maria had envisioned was rapidly becoming a circus. Lieutenant Mitchell, monitoring her electronic equipment, called out new complications. Wind patterns are shifting earlier than predicted. The thermal column is developing, but there's a high-pressure system moving in from the west that could destabilize conditions. This information sent a ripple of concern through the observation crowd. The shot had been planned around specific meteorological conditions, and any significant change could render Maria's calculations useless. Worse, if conditions deteriorated beyond acceptable limits, the attempt would have to be postponed or canceled, a decision that would satisfy none of the competing interests now invested in the outcome. General Whitman approached Colonel Hawthorne with obvious concern. "James, maybe we should consider postponing until conditions stabilize." "Ma'am," Hawthorne replied, his voice carrying the strain of command decisions made under impossible circumstances. "Santos has been preparing for this specific weather window for months. She's identified variables that my meteorology staff didn't even know existed. If we postpone now, we're admitting that the shot truly is impossible." The conversation was overheard by several reporters who immediately began transmitting updates to their networks. "This is Sarah Chun, CNN, reporting from the Mojave Desert where Army sniper Maria Santos is attempting what may be the most difficult shot in military history. We're hearing that weather conditions are deteriorating and officials are debating whether to proceed with the demonstration." The live television coverage added another layer of pressure. Millions of viewers were now watching, waiting to see whether one soldier could push the boundaries of human capability or whether the laws of physics would prove immutable. Comment sections on news websites were already filling with speculation, criticism, and support. Master Sergeant William Bull Patterson, the most senior instructor at the Army Marksmanship Unit and a legend in military shooting circles, made his way to Maria's position. At 55, Patterson had forgotten more about long-range shooting than most soldiers ever learned, and his opinion carried enormous weight throughout the community. "Santos," Patterson's gravelly voice carried the authority of someone who had earned respect through decades of exceptional performance. "I've been shooting for 37 years. I've made shots that people said were impossible. But what you're attempting ... double quotes." He paused, studying her face. "This isn't about proving you're the best shooter in the Army. We already know that. This is about something else entirely." Maria met his gaze steadily. "What is it about, Sergeant?" "It's about changing what people believe is possible. And that's a hell of a responsibility to put on one bullet." The weight of Patterson's words settled over the immediate area like a physical presence. This wasn't just about marksmanship anymore. It was about the power of human potential, the role of women in combat, the limits of technology, and the question of whether extraordinary individuals could transcend the boundaries that constrained ordinary performance. Dr. Amanda Foster, a ballistics physicist from the Army Research Laboratory, had been conducting her own calculations since arriving at the range. Her computer models, based on real-time meteorological data and precise measurements of every relevant variable, painted a sobering picture. Colonel Hawthorne, Dr. Foster approached the command group with her laptop displaying complex mathematical projections. My models show success probability dropping to less than 0.5%. The crosswinds are too variable, the thermal effects too unpredictable. Even with perfect marksmanship, the physics are working against us. The scientific assessment created a new dynamic among the observers. Those who had come hoping to witness something extraordinary now faced the possibility that they were about to watch a very public failure. The political implications were becoming clearer by the minute, but Maria Santos, lying behind her rifle in the shooting position, seemed insulated from the growing chaos around her. Her world had contracted to the familiar elements of precision shooting, the feel of the rifle against her shoulder, the crosshairs in her scope, the rhythm of her breathing, and the complex calculations that would transform intention into action. Across 4,500 meters of hostile terrain. Staff Sergeant Chen, monitoring conditions through his spotting scope, reported what Maria already knew. Thermals developing, but it's unstable. Winds gusting to 40 knots. We've got dust devils forming. Downrange that could affect trajectory. The dust devils were a new complication, miniature tornadoes of superheated air that could deflect a bullet by several feet at extreme range. Maria watched them through her scope, studying their patterns, calculating their effects on her planned trajectory. There's something else, Chen continued, his voice carrying a note of concern. We've got media helicopters requesting permission to film from downrange. If they're approved, we'll have rotor wash affecting wind patterns right as you're shooting. The helicopter issue represented the collision between military necessity and media spectacle. The networks wanted dramatic footage of the bullet's flight path and impact, but their presence would make an already impossible shot even more difficult. Lieutenant Mitchell, juggling multiple electronic devices and fielding constant questions from reporters, called out an update that sent a chill through the observation area. Humidity's rising faster than predicted. We're looking at significant atmospheric density changes that could affect bullet velocity. Every piece of new information seemed to reduce the probability of success. The shot that had begun as a calculated risk was rapidly becoming an exercise in defying not just probability, but the fundamental laws of physics themselves. Yet through it all, Maria remained focused on the target downrange. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Mia, they will tell you what you cannot do because they cannot imagine doing it themselves. The growing crowd of doubters, the deteriorating conditions, the political pressure, all of it faded into background noise as she concentrated on the only thing that mattered. The moment when her finger would press the trigger and physics would determine whether the impossible was truly impossible. Colonel Hawthorne's radio crackled with another update from Range Command. All stations, be advised that we have congressional representatives en route. 15 minutes. The arrival of politicians would complete the transformation of Maria's demonstration from training exercise to national spectacle. Success would be celebrated as validation of military excellence and American capability. Failure would become a symbol of overreach, of resources wasted on impossible dreams. Congressman Robert Walsh, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, emerged from the lead vehicle with the confident stride of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic among the military observers, who straightened their postures and adjusted their expressions to the neutral professionalism required when dealing with civilian oversight. Colonel Hawthorne, Walsh, approached the range commander with a political smile that didn't reach his eyes. I understand we're about to witness something historic. I hope the Army isn't gambling with taxpayer resources on publicity stunts. The congressman's words carried an edge that everyone within earshot recognized. Walsh had been a vocal critic of what he termed experimental training programs and had repeatedly questioned the cost-effectiveness of advanced marksmanship schools. A failed shot here would provide ammunition for his ongoing campaigned to reduce funding for specialized military training. Maria, through her rifle scope, could see the target clearly despite the distance. The ace of spades appeared as a dark speck against the wooden post, but her calculations accounted for every millimeter of its dimensions. The razor blade, invisible at this range, existed in her mind as a precise mathematical pointer, target no wider than the margin for error in her rifle's mechanical precision. But the growing chaos behind her was beginning to penetrate her concentration. The sound of helicopter rotors approached from the east as news crews positioned themselves for aerial footage. Radio chatter filled the air as range safety officers coordinated with multiple agencies. The simple purity of marksmanship was being overwhelmed by the complexities of public spectacle. Santos, General Whitman's voice cut through the noise as she approached the shooting position. I need you to understand something. If you miss this shot, there will be consequences beyond your career. Programs will be cut. Training budgets will be questioned. The credibility of everything we've built here will be challenged. Maria's finger traced the familiar contours of her rifle's trigger guard as she processed the general's words. The shot had always been about more than personal achievement, but the stakes were becoming clearer with each passing minute. She was carrying the weight not just of her own reputation, but of an entire approach to military training that emphasized pushing boundaries and achieving the impossible. Staff Sergeant Chen, monitoring the increasingly chaotic conditions, reported new complications. Multiple aircraft in the area are affecting wind patterns. I'm reading gusts up to 45 knots, and they're completely unpredictable. The helicopter traffic was creating artificial wind shear that made accurate calculation nearly impossible. Each aircraft introduced its own pattern of rotor wash and atmospheric disturbance, adding variables that no amount of preparation could fully account for. Lieutenant Mitchell, surrounded by reporters and struggling to maintain her equipment setup, called out warnings that sent ripples of concern through the observation area. Atmospheric density is fluctuating beyond acceptable parameters. The thermal column we've been counting on is becoming unstable. Dr. Foster, the ballistics physicist, updated her computer models in real time and arrived at conclusions that confirmed everyone's worst fears. Colonel, the probability of success has dropped below statistical significance. We're looking at odds that approach mathematical impossibility. The scientific assessment created a moment of silence among the observers. Even the most optimistic supporters had to acknowledge that they were witnessing an attempt that violated every principle of practical marksmanship. The distance was too great, the conditions too hostile, the target too small, and the margin for error too narrow. But Master Sergeant Patterson, the grizzled veteran who had seen impossible things become routine through decades of military service, stepped forward with a different perspective. Sir, with respect to Dr. Foster and her calculations, I've learned that mathematics can tell you what's probable, but it can't tell you what's possible. Sometimes you have to trust the shooter. Patterson's words carried weight because of his reputation, but they also highlighted the fundamental tension at the heart of the demonstration. This was a collision between scientific certainty and human potential, between mathematical probability and the kind of extraordinary capability that had always defined elite military units. Congressman Walsh, sensing an opportunity to make his point about resource allocation, addressed the crowd of observers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're watching the Army attempt something that their own scientists say is essentially impossible. This is exactly the kind of thinking that leads to budget overruns and wasted resources. The political grandstanding created an immediate backlash among the military personnel present. Several officers exchanged glances that conveyed their opinion of civilian interference in military training. The demonstration was becoming a proxy battle between different philosophies of military development, conservative resource management versus aggressive capability advancement. Maria, through all of this chaos, maintained her focus on the fundamental elements of the shot. Her breathing remained controlled, her heartbeat steady, her grip on the rifle consistent with 12 years of training and combat experience. The target downrange existed in her mind not as an impossible challenge, but as a problem with a solution that required perfect execution of known techniques. 10 minutes until optimal thermal conditions, Lieutenant Mitchell announced, though her voice carried less confidence than it had earlier in the morning. The window of opportunity that Maria had identified was approaching, but the deteriorating conditions threatened to close it. Before she could take advantage, the media attention reached a crescendo as live television coverage switched to continuous reporting. Millions of viewers were now watching, waiting to see whether one soldier could defy physics and achieve something that existed at the very edge of human capability. Social media platforms buzzed with real-time commentary, betting pools, and passionate debates about the limits of military training. Colonel Hawthorne faced the most difficult decision of his career. Proceed with the shot under deteriorating conditions and risk a very public failure, or cancel the demonstration and face criticism for wasting resources on an impossible dream. Either choice carried significant professional and political consequences. Santos. The colonel approached the shooting position with the weight of command evident in his voice. I need your honest assessment. Can you make this shot? Maria's response came without hesitation, her voice carrying the calm certainty that had made her legendary among her peers. Sir, the conditions are hostile, but they're not outside the parameters I've prepared for. The shot is still possible. But is it probable? Maria turned from her rifle scope to meet the colonel's gaze directly. Sir, if we only attempted what was probable, we'd never discover what was possible. The philosophical difference in their approaches was clear. The colonel was thinking like a commander, weighing risks and probabilities. Maria was thinking like an artist, focused on the intersection of preparation, opportunity, and will that could transform the impossible into reality. Master Sergeant Patterson, overhearing the exchange, added his perspective with the authority of 3 decades in military marksmanship. Colonel, I've seen Santos shoot under conditions that would break most snipers. If anyone can make this shot, it's her. And if she can't, then it truly is impossible. The endorsement from Patterson carried enormous weight, but it also increased the pressure on Maria. She was no longer just attempting a difficult shot. She was representing the pinnacle of military marksmanship capability, the absolute limit of what human training and dedication could achieve. Staff Sergeant Chen, who had been quietly monitoring conditions and making calculations, suddenly spoke with urgency that cut through all other conversations. Maria, the thermal column is stabilizing. Winds dropping to 28 knots and holding steady. This might be our window. The moment everyone had been waiting for was approaching. All the politics, all the media attention, all the scientific predictions and military posturing would soon be reduced to a single bullet traveling 4,500 meters through hostile conditions toward a target the size of a razor blade. Lieutenant Mitchell confirmed Chen's observations with her electronic monitoring equipment. Eventsphere conditions are reaching optimal parameters. Thermal stability increasing. This is the window we calculated. Dr. Foster, despite her pessimistic mathematical projections, found herself caught up in the drama of the moment. Even if the physics are against us, this represents the most precisely controlled ballistics experiment ever attempted under field conditions. The data alone will be invaluable. General Whitman, recognizing that the moment of decision had arrived, made the call that would define her legacy as much as Maria's. Santos, you are authorized to proceed. Make the shot. The authorization rippled through the observation area like an electric current. Reporters pressed closer to their cameras. Military personnel held their collective breath, and politicians positioned themselves to claim credit for success or distance themselves from failure. Maria settled into her final shooting position. feeling the familiar weight of her rifle, sensing the rhythm of the wind, calculating the 1,000 variables that would determine whether physics would bend a human will or prove immutable. Her grandmother's spirit seemed to whisper in the desert, "Breeze, Mia, this is not about the shot. This is about who you choose to become in the moment, when everything depends on your courage." The impossible shot was 60 seconds away. The desert held its breath as Maria Santos made her final preparations, her movements deliberate and precise despite the chaos surrounding her. 47 people watched from the observation line. Their collective tension so palpable it seemed to shimmer in the heat like a mirage. The moment that would define careers, validate theories, and potentially change military training doctrine forever was measured now in heartbeats rather than minutes. Through her rifle scope, Maria could see the target with crystalline clarity. The ace of spades appeared as a dark rectangle against the weathered wood, and though the razor blade was invisible at this distance, she could visualize its exact position with mathematical precision. Every calculation had been checked and rechecked. Every variable had been measured and compensated for. All that remained was the translation of preparation into action. Staff Sergeant Chen, his eye pressed to his spotting scope, provided the final environmental readings in a voice that carried. Across the suddenly quiet desert. Wind steady at 26 knots from the southwest. Temperature stable at 87 degrees. Humidity holding at 32%. Range confirmed at 4,517 meters. Lieutenant Mitchell's electronic equipment registered the optimal conditions they had waited months to achieve. Thermal column fully developed and stable. Atmospheric density consistent. This is it, Maria. This is our window. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant thrum of helicopter rotors and the whisper of wind through sagebrush. Maria's breathing slowed to the rhythm she had practiced 10,000 times, each inhalation and exhalation controlled with the precision that separated good shooters from legendary ones. Her heart rate, which she had trained to remain below 50 beats per minute during critical shots, settled into its familiar cadence. Colonel Hawthorne, standing with the observation group, felt his own pulse accelerating as he watched the culmination of months of preparation. His career had been built on calculated risks and successful innovations, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of this moment. Success would validate his support for experimental training programs. Failure would raise questions about his judgment that would follow him for the rest of his military service. General Whitman, the highest-ranking officer present, found herself thinking about the broader implications of what they were witnessing. The Army's investment in advanced marksmanship training had always been based on the belief that exceptional individuals, given proper resources and training, could achieve extraordinary results. Maria Santos represented the culmination of that philosophy, and her success or failure would influence military doctrine for decades to come. The media representatives, sensing the historical significance of the moment, maintained an unusual quiet. Cameras rolled continuously, but the typical chatter of live television reporting had been replaced by respectful silence. Even the most cynical journalists recognized that they were witnessing something that transcended normal boundaries between possible and impossible. Dr. Amanda Foster, despite her mathematical predictions of failure, found herself hoping that human capability could somehow overcome the laws of physics. Her computer model showed success as statistically insignificant, but she had learned through years of research that statistics described probabilities, not absolute limitations. Maria's finger found the trigger, applying just enough pressure to take up the slack without firing. Her world had contracted to the essential elements, the crosshairs centered on the target, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the feel of the rifle against her shoulder, and the mathematical certainty that physics would carry her bullet to its intended destination. 60 seconds to optimal thermal stability, Lieutenant Mitchell announced, her voice barely above a whisper. Master Sergeant Patterson, watching from the observation line, recognized the signs of a shooter entering the zone of perfect concentration. In 37 years of military marksmanship, he had seen perhaps a dozen individuals achieve this level of focus, and he knew that what they were about to witness would either be miraculous or heartbreaking. The first revelation came not from the shot itself, but from the profound silence that descended over the range as Maria entered her final sequence. 47 people, representing millions of dollars in training, decades of combined experience, and the hopes of an entire military community, watched one soldier prepare to challenge the fundamental limits of human capability. 30 seconds. Mitchell called softly. Maria's breathing deepened, each cycle precisely timed to the rhythm she had practiced until it became as natural as her own heartbeat. Through her scope, she could see heat waves beginning to dance across the desert floor, the thermal effects that would create the corridor of stable air she needed for success. Staff Sergeant Chen, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, provided the final countdown. Thermal column fully stable. Wind holding steady at 24 knots. Conditions optimal. You have the shot. Maria's finger applied pressure to the trigger with the same precision she had used to save lives in Afghanistan, to protect innocence. In Iraq, to achieve the impossible in countless training exercises that had led to this moment. The trigger broke with a clean snap that seemed to echo across the entire desert. The .50 caliber bullet erupted from the muzzle at 2,800 feet per second, its brass casing spinning in a golden arc that caught the morning sunlight. The recoil, absorbed by the rifle's advanced muzzle brake and Maria's expert body position, was barely noticeable. But the sound, the sharp crack of the shot, followed by the supersonic boom of the bullet's passage, seemed to shake the very foundations of the desert. For 2.3 seconds, the bullet traveled through the hostile air of the Mojave, following a trajectory that had been calculated to account for wind drift, bullet drop, atmospheric density, temperature variations, and the subtle influence of the Earth's rotation. During those seconds, 47 people held their breath, and millions of television viewers around the world waited to learn whether human determination could overcome mathematical impossibility. Lieutenant Mitchell's high-speed camera, capable of capturing 10,000 frames per second, recorded what human eyes could not perceive. The bullet's flight path remained true through the first 1,000 meters, its spin stabilizing it against the crosswinds that threatened to push it off course. At 2,000 meters, the thermal column created the corridor of stable air that Maria had predicted, allowing the bullet to maintain its precise trajectory. At 3,000 meters, where most expert marksmen would consider a shot impossibly difficult, Maria's bullet continued to track toward its target with the inevitability of physics perfectly harnessed by human skill. The heat, shimmer, and atmospheric disturbances that had worried the observers proved no match for calculations based on months of study and a lifetime of dedication to the art of precision shooting. At 4,000 meters, with 500 meters remaining to the target, the bullet began to encounter the most challenging part of its journey. Crosswinds that had been partially blocked by terrain features now had full effect, and the bullet's velocity had decreased enough that atmospheric influences became more significant. But Maria's calculations had accounted for every variable. The bullet, though slowed by air resistance and pushed slightly by crosswinds, continued on the trajectory she had plotted with mathematical precision. The moment of impact, when it came, was captured in perfect detail by Lieutenant Mitchell's camera equipment. The bullet struck the razor blade at its exact center with such precision that the impact was visible only as the briefest flash of reflected sunlight. The blade, stressed beyond its physical limits, split the bullet into two perfect halves, each fragment continuing its journey to strike the wooden post on either side of the ace of spades. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across eternity. For several seconds, no one moved, no one spoke, no one seemed to breathe. The implications of what they had witnessed were too enormous to process immediately, Then Staff Sergeant Chen's voice broke the silence, his words carrying across the desert with the authority of confirmed observation. Direct hit. Bullet split. Both fragments impacted the post. Shot successful. The explosion of reaction from the observation area was instantaneous and overwhelming. Military personnel who had maintained professional composure throughout the morning erupted in cheers and applause. Media representatives scrambled to their equipment, transmitting news of the impossible shot to audiences around the world. Politicians who had arrived skeptical found themselves witnesses to a demonstration of American military capability that exceeded their wildest expectations. General Whitman, her own voice tight with emotion, approached the shooting position where Maria was still lying behind her rifle. "Santos, do you understand what you just accomplished?" Maria slowly raised her head from the scope, her dark eyes reflecting a calm satisfaction that seemed almost anticlimactic after the dramatic build-up. "Ma'am, I made the shot I trained to make." But the second revelation was already becoming apparent. To the observers, this wasn't just about one extraordinary shot, it was about the validation of an entire approach to human development that emphasized pushing beyond accepted limitations. Maria Santos had just proven that the boundaries others accepted as immutable were simply challenges waiting for the right combination of talent, training, and determination. Colonel Hawthorne, his radio crackling with congratulations from command headquarters, found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about the limits of military training. "Santos, this changes everything. The applications for combat situations, for training programs, for what we believe is possible." The third revelation emerged as Lieutenant Mitchell analyzed the high-speed camera footage. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need you to see this," she announced, connecting her camera to a large monitor that had been set up for the media. The bullet didn't just split, it split with mathematical precision. Both halves are exactly equal in mass and traveled exactly parallel trajectories. The footage, slowed to show every detail of the bullet's impact, revealed something that bordered on the miraculous. The split wasn't random, it was perfectly controlled. Each half of the bullet following a trajectory that had been predicted by Maria's calculations. She hadn't just hit an impossibly small target. She had demonstrated a level of precision that redefined what human beings were capable of achieving. Dr. Foster, reviewing her own calculations against the observed results, made the fourth revelation. The atmospheric conditions that we thought would make the shot impossible actually created a corridor of stability that made it inevitable. Sergeant Santos didn't overcome the physics, she used physics with a level of understanding that exceeds our predictive models. This understanding transformed the discussion from one about exceptional marksmanship to one about exceptional knowledge. Maria hadn't just trained her body to perform impossible feats. She had developed an intuitive understanding of complex physical systems that allowed her to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. The fifth revelation came from Master Sergeant Patterson, whose decades of experience gave him perspective that others lacked. "This isn't just about shooting," he announced to the gathering crowd. "This is about what happens when someone refuses to accept the limitations that others take for granted." Santos didn't just make an impossible shot, she proved that the word impossible needs to be redefined. Congressman Walsh, who had arrived expecting to witness waste and overreach, found himself confronting something that challenged his fundamental assumptions about government investment and human potential. The shot had cost thousands of dollars in training and equipment, but it had also demonstrated capabilities that could revolutionize military operations and inspire a generation of young Americans to pursue excellence. The sixth revelation was perhaps the most significant. The shot had been witnessed by representatives of foreign militaries who had been invited as observers. The demonstration of American military capability, broadcast live around the world, sent a message about the sophistication of U.S. training programs that would influence international relations for years to come. but for Maria Santos, lying on the desert floor with her rifle still trained on the distant target, the most important revelation was personal. She had proven to herself that the voice her grandmother had taught her to listen for, the voice that whispered of possibilities beyond conventional limitations, was reliable. The impossible shot had become inevitable through preparation, patience, and the courage to attempt what others deemed impossible. As the celebration continued around her, Maria finally allowed herself to smile. The bullet that had traveled 4,500 meters through hostile conditions to split on her razor blade had carried more than just kinetic energy. It had carried the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of everyone who had ever been told that their goals were impossible. The shot heard around the world had proven that impossible was simply another word for what hadn't happened yet. 3 hours after the impossible shot that split a bullet at 4,500 meters, Maria Santos found herself in the surreal position of being the most famous soldier in America. Her phone had been confiscated by military protocol officers to prevent unauthorized media contact, but the notifications kept arriving through official channels. The president wanted to speak with her. Congress was drafting a resolution. The Secretary of Defense was flying to the base, but Maria sat in the quiet of the base chapel, still wearing her dusty BDUs, staring at the same photograph of her grandmother that had guided her through every challenge of her military career. The woman in the faded image seemed to be smiling with particular satisfaction, as if she had always known this moment would come. "I did it, Abuela," Maria whispered to the empty chapel. "I made the shot you always said was waiting for me." The chapel door opened quietly, and Chaplain David Morrison entered with the careful step of someone who understood the weight of extraordinary moments. At 62, Morrison had counseled soldiers through every crisis imaginable, but he had never encountered someone who had just redefined the limits of human capability. "Mind if I sit?" Morrison asked, gesturing to the pew beside Maria. "Please," Maria replied, grateful for the company of someone who wouldn't immediately start discussing television interviews and training applications. "You know," Morrison said after they had sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, "in 30 years of military service, I've learned that the most significant moments often feel the quietest afterward. How are you processing all this?" Maria considered the question carefully. "I keep thinking about my grandmother's ranch in New Mexico. She used to say that every shot was practice for the one that would define your life. I always thought she was talking about hunting, but maybe she was talking about something bigger." The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock at the chapel door. Staff Sergeant Chen entered, his face showing the exhaustion and exhilaration of someone who had just participated in making history. "Maria," Chen said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and amazement, "I've been your spotter for 4 years, and I thought I understood what you were capable of. But today, ... He paused, struggling to find adequate words. "Today you changed. What's possible?" Over the following hours, the implications of Maria's shot began to ripple outward through military and civilian communities. The Army Marksmanship Unit received over 3,000 inquiries from young people wanting to know how to begin sniper training. Recruiting stations across the country reported increased interest from women who had never considered military service but were inspired by Maria's achievement. Lieutenant Mitchell, who had documented every aspect of the shot with scientific precision, found herself inundated with requests from universities, research institutions, and military contractors. The ballistics data from the impossible shot would influence training programs, equipment development, and theoretical research for decades to come. "Maria," Mitchell said, finding her in the chapel as evening approached, "do you understand that what you accomplish today will be studied by physicists, engineers, and military strategists for generations? You didn't just make a difficult shot, you expanded our understanding of what human beings can achieve." But perhaps the most significant immediate impact came from an unexpected source, Dr. Layla Rashid, the Afghan girl whose life Maria had saved during her second tour, had been watching the live coverage from her dormitory room at MIT, where she was studying aerospace engineering. The girl who had written a thank you letter to the American sniper lady was now a brilliant young woman whose own achievements had been made possible by Maria's protection years earlier. "I watched you make the impossible shot," Dr. Rashid said. During a video call that evening, her face illuminated by the glow of her computer screen. "But I've been watching you make impossible things possible my entire life. You saved me when I was 8 years old, and now I'm designing spacecraft. Your bullet today traveled 4,500 meters, but the shot you took in Afghanistan traveled across time to change the world." The connection between past and present, between protection and possibility, struck Maria with profound force. The impossible shot had been spectacular, but it was built on a foundation of countless smaller impossibilities, moments when one person's courage and skill had created opportunities for others to flourish. General Whitman, who had arrived at the chapel with official business to discuss, found herself drawn into a deeper conversation about the nature of leadership and inspiration. "Santos," the general said, settling into a pew with the informal ease of someone who had moved beyond military protocol, "I need you to understand that what happened today extends far beyond marksmanship. You've become a symbol of what's possible. When we refuse to accept conventional limitations." The weight of symbolism was something Maria was still learning to process. She had joined the army to serve her country and test her own limits, not to become a representative of broader possibilities. But the reality of her position was becoming undeniable. Colonel Hawthorne joined the growing group in the chapel, bringing with him updates from the highest levels of military command. "The Pentagon wants to build an entire training program around what you accomplished today. Advanced atmospheric analysis, extreme-range marksmanship, psychological preparation for impossible challenges. They're talking about the Santos method." The idea of having a training methodology named after her made Maria profoundly uncomfortable. "Sir, with respect, what I did today wasn't magic. It was preparation, calculation, and the willingness to attempt something that others assumed was impossible. Those principles can be taught. That's exactly why they want you to teach them," Hawthorne replied. "Santos, you've just proven that human potential extends far beyond what we thought possible. The military applications alone could revolutionize how we think about training and capability development." Over the following days, the transformation of Maria's life became complete. The impossible shot had made her the most recognizable soldier in America, but it had also created opportunities and responsibilities she had never anticipated. The first formal recognition came in the form of a personal call from the president, who spoke with Maria for 20 minutes about service, dedication, and the importance of pushing boundaries. "Sergeant Santos," the president said, "you've shown the world that Americans don't just accept limitations, we overcome them. Your shot today represents the best of what our country can achieve." Congressional leaders from both parties praised Maria's achievement as evidence of American military excellence and the value of investing in advanced training programs. The shot that had begun as a simple demonstration had become a symbol of national capability and determination. But the most meaningful recognition came from fellow soldiers, the community of warriors who understood the true significance of what Maria had accomplished. Letters and messages arrived from snipers around the world, from training instructors who had spent decades pushing the boundaries of marksmanship, from military leaders who recognized the strategic implications of expanded human capability. Master Sergeant Patterson, whose endorsement had carried enormous weight during the pre-shot discussions, summarized the military community's response in characteristically direct terms. "Santos, you've raised the bar for everyone. What was impossible yesterday is now the standard we'll all be measured against." The technical implications of the shot were equally significant. Dr. Foster's analysis of the ballistics data revealed insights that would influence military equipment development for years to come. The atmospheric modeling techniques that Maria had developed intuitively would be formalized into training protocols. The precision achieved at extreme range would drive improvements in rifle design, ammunition manufacturing, and optical systems. Lieutenant Mitchell, who had documented every aspect of the achievement, found herself appointed to lead a new research program focused on extreme-range marksmanship. "Maria," she said during one of their many debriefing sessions, "your shot today will influence military training for the next 50 years. We're not just teaching people to shoot better, we're teaching them to think differently about what's possible." The international response was equally significant. Military observers from allied nations requested access to the training techniques that had produced such extraordinary results. The demonstration of American military capability had strategic implications that extended far beyond marksmanship. But for Maria, the most important legacy was personal. She had proven to herself that the voice her grandmother had taught her to trust, the voice that whispered of possibilities beyond conventional limitations, was not just reliable, but essential for achieving extraordinary results. 6 months after the impossible shot, Maria stood on the same ridge where she had split a bullet at 4,500 meters, but this time she was not alone. 12 young soldiers, each selected for their potential to push beyond conventional boundaries, were learning the principles that had made the impossible shot possible. "The rifle doesn't make the shot," Maria told her students, echoing her grandmother's wisdom. "The mind does. The heart does. The willingness to prepare for opportunities that others can't even imagine. That's what makes impossible shots possible." The training program that had developed around Maria's achievement was producing results that validated her belief in human potential. Students were routinely achieving accuracy levels that had been considered impossible just months earlier. The techniques were being applied beyond marksmanship to medicine, engineering, space exploration, and any field where human beings needed to transcend accepted limitations. Staff Sergeant Chen, who had been promoted and given his own training command, often reflected on the morning when he had helped make history. "Maria," he said during one of their regular check-ins, "that shot changed more than ballistics records. It changed how we think about human potential itself." The impossible shot had become a case study taught in military academies, business schools, and leadership programs around the world. But for Maria Santos, it remained what it had always been: proof that the boundaries others accepted as immutable were simply challenges waiting for the right person, with the right preparation and the right moment. Standing on the ridge, where she had redefined the possible, watching her students prepare for their own impossible shots, Maria felt her grandmother's presence in the desert wind. The woman who had taught her to listen to the voice that whispered of possibilities beyond conventional limitations would have been proud. The impossible shot had traveled 4,500 meters through hostile conditions to split on a razor blade. But its real journey was just beginning, carried forward by every person who refused to accept that impossible was anything more than a temporary condition waiting to be overcome. 5 years later, Dr. Maria Santos adjusted the microphone at the podium of the International Conference on Human Potential, her army dress blues replaced by the academic robes of her newly completed Ph.D. in applied physics from MIT. The auditorium was filled with representatives from 37 countries, all eager to understand how one impossible shot had revolutionized training methodologies across multiple disciplines. 5 years ago, Maria began, her voice carrying the same calm confidence that had guided her through the most challenging shot in military history. "I lay on a ridge in the Mojave Desert and proved that impossible was simply another word for hasn't happened yet. Today, I want to tell you about the journey that shot began, and the lives it has touched in ways I never could have imagined." In the front row sat Dr. Layla Rashid, now a successful aerospace engineer at NASA, whose childhood rescue by Maria had led to innovations in spacecraft guidance systems that bore striking resemblance to extreme-range ballistics calculations. Beside her sat Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, whose research program had produced breakthrough advances in atmospheric modeling that were being applied to everything from weather prediction to climate science. 2 years later, the Santos Institute for Advanced Human Performance had become the most prestigious training facility in the world, attracting not just military personnel, but surgeons seeking to improve their precision, engineers working on projects that demanded impossible accuracy, and athletes pushing the boundaries of human capability. The facility, built on the site where Maria had made her impossible shot, served as a constant reminder that human potential was limited only by imagination and preparation. The key insight, Dr. Santos explained to a group of international visitors touring the facility, is that what we call impossible is usually just unprecedented. The laws of physics don't change, but our understanding of how to work within them constantly evolves. Among the visitors was General Chen, the former spotter who had helped guide the most famous shot in military history. Now commanding the Army's Advanced Training Command, Chen had overseen the development of programs that routinely produced results that would have been considered miraculous just a decade earlier. Maria taught us that preparation and possibility are the same thing, Chen told the visiting delegation. When you prepare for something completely, it stops being impossible and becomes inevitable. 10 years later, the documentary, The Shot That Changed Everything, premiered simultaneously in 48 countries, chronicling not just Maria's achievement, but the ripple effects that had transformed military training, scientific research, and human development programs around the world. The film featured interviews with the hundreds of individuals whose lives had been directly changed by the principles demonstrated that day in the Mojave Desert. Dr. Tommy Chen, Jr., son of Maria's former spotter, had just graduated from West Point with the highest marksmanship scores in Academy history. His acceptance speech to the graduating class reflected the lessons his father had learned from watching impossible become inevitable. "We stand on the shoulders of those who refuse to accept limitations," the young officer said. "My father helped guide a bullet 4,500 meters to split on a razor blade, but more importantly, he helped guide our understanding of what human beings can achieve when they refuse to accept conventional boundaries." 15 years later, the Santos method had become standard curriculum in military academies, medical schools, engineering programs, and leadership development courses worldwide. The principles of extreme preparation, atmospheric analysis, psychological conditioning, and systematic boundary pushing had applications that extended far beyond marksmanship. Dr. Alina Santos Morrison, Maria's daughter, stood at the same podium where her mother had delivered her landmark speech on human potential. At 22, Elena was already recognized as a pioneering researcher in neuroscience and human performance optimization. "My mother's shot traveled 4,500 meters," Elena told the assembled scientists and military leaders, "but the principles behind it have traveled around the world and into the future." Every time someone achieves something previously thought impossible, they're applying lessons learned on a desert ridge in Nevada. The audience included representatives from the Mars colonization program, where extreme precision techniques developed from military marksmanship were being used to guide spacecraft across millions of miles of space. The connection between a bullet splitting on a razor blade and humanity's expansion to other planets represented the kind of unexpected progression that had defined the Santos legacy. 20 years later, Brigadier General Maria Santos, retired, returned to the shooting range where her career had been defined, but this time she was accompanied by her granddaughter, 8-year-old Esperanza Cien Santos, the child whose mixed heritage reflected the global community that had grown around her grandmother's legacy. possessed the same steady hands and unwavering focus that had characterized the Santos family for generations. Abuela Maria, the little girl asked, studying the monument that marked the spot where the impossible shot had been taken, "Why do people say your shot was so special? It was just physics, right?" Maria smiled, remembering her own grandmother's lessons about the difference between what was impossible and what was simply waiting for the right person at the right moment. "You're absolutely right, Mia. It was just physics." But sometimes, understanding physics so completely that you can make it work for you instead of against you, that's what people call magic. The little girl nodded solemnly, then picked up a small rock and threw it with impressive accuracy at a target 50 meters away. "I want to learn the physics too, Abuela." "Then we'll start tomorrow," Maria replied, knowing that another generation was ready to discover that impossible was simply another word for hasn't happened yet. 25 years later, the Esperanza Santos Memorial Observatory, the most advanced atmospheric research facility on Earth, stood where the old shooting range had been. Dr. Esperanza Chen Santos, now 33 and the director of the International Institute for Impossible Solutions, conducted the dedication ceremony for a new monument commemorating not just one shot, but the transformation of human understanding that had followed. My great-grandmother Esperanza Santos taught my grandmother that the only voice that mattered was the one that whispered possibilities in quiet moments. Dr. Chen Santos told the assembled crowd. My grandmother Maria proved that whisper was the voice of physics itself, waiting for someone prepared enough to listen. The monument was unique in its design, a bronze figure of a woman sighting down a rifle, but the bullet's trajectory was represented by a stream of light that extended beyond the horizon, symbolizing possibilities without end. Children from the local schools came regularly to visit the monument, learning that limitations were temporary conditions waiting to be overcome by preparation and courage. Staff Sergeant Chen, now 97 and one of the last surviving witnesses to the original shot, often visited the memorial with his great-grandchildren. His stories had become legend, but his message remained simple. Your great-grandmother Maria taught us that when someone tells you something is impossible, they're really telling you that they don't know how to make it possible yet. 30 years later, the colony ships launching for Alpha Centauri carried guidance systems based on extreme precision principles developed from military marksmanship. The connection between a bullet traveling 4,500 meters through Earth's atmosphere and humanity's expansion to other star systems represented the kind of exponential progression that had defined the Santos legacy. Commander Elena Santos Morrison, now leading humanity's first interstellar expedition, carried with her the same photograph that had guided her mother through every challenge. Esperanza Santos, standing on her ranch porch, teaching a young girl that limitations existed only in the minds of those who couldn't imagine transcending them. Mission Control. Commander Santos Morrison transmitted as her ship passed beyond the orbit of Pluto. We have achieved optimal trajectory for Alpha Centauri. Estimated arrival in 47 years. The shot continues to find its target. Back on Earth, in the quiet of the chapel where Maria Santos had once processed the weight of achieving the impossible, a new generation of students learned the same fundamental lesson. Preparation and possibility were the same thing. And the only true limitation was the willingness to accept that limitations were permanent. The documentary archives contained thousands of hours of footage chronicling the ripple effects of one impossible shot. But the most powerful moments were always the simplest: children learning to aim, students discovering they could achieve more than they imagined, and individuals realizing that impossible was simply another word for hasn't happened yet. 50 years later, the message arrived from Alpha Centauri at the speed of light, carrying 4 years across the void between stars. Colony established, population thriving. Next target, Proxima Centauri. The impossible shot continues. On Earth, In the museum that had grown around the Santos legacy, visitors from around the world came to see the rifle that had split a bullet at 4,500 meters and started humanity on a journey that was still continuing. But the most popular exhibit wasn't the rifle or the high-speed footage or the mathematical calculations. It was a simple handwritten note displayed behind protective glass. Mia, they will tell you what you cannot do because they cannot imagine doing it themselves. But the only voice that matters is the one that whispers in your heart when the world is quiet. Listen for that voice and trust it always. It knows the difference between impossible and inevitable. The note was signed Esperanza Santos, 1952 to 2045. And below it, in different handwriting, was the addition, "She was right. Maria Santos, 2021 to 2089. Below that, in yet another hand, "The shot continues. Elena Santos Morrison, 205-12134. And at the bottom, in the newest edition, "Still traveling. Esperanza Chen Santos, 2079. The museum's guestbook contained entries from visitors representing every nation on Earth and the 13 colony worlds humanity had established among the stars. The most common comment, written in dozens of languages, was always the same. "Thank you for proving that impossible is just another word for hasn't happened yet." The final display in the museum was a live video feed from the shooting range, where new students representing the latest generation of possibility seekers practiced the fundamentals that had been established more than half a century ago. The instructors still began each session with the same words Maria Santos had used to train her first students. "The rifle doesn't make the shot. The mind does. The heart does. The willingness to prepare for opportunities that others can't even imagine. That's what makes impossible shots possible." And in the quiet moments between shots, when the desert wind whispered across the range where history had been made, students sometimes reported hearing an echo of something that sounded like an elderly woman's voice, teaching patience and precision. To anyone willing to listen, "Mia, every shot is practice for the one that will define your life." The impossible shot, fired on a desert morning more than 50 years ago, had traveled farther than anyone could have imagined. It had carried human understanding beyond the boundaries of Earth's atmosphere, beyond the limitations of conventional thinking, and beyond the borders between possible and impossible. And it was still traveling, carried forward by every person who refused to accept that limitations were permanent, by every student who learned that preparation and possibility were the same thing, and by every dreamer who understood that impossible was simply another word for what hadn't happened yet. The bullet that split on a razor blade at 4,500 meters had found its ultimate target, the human capacity to transcend any boundary that imagination could envision. In the end, Maria Santos had been right. Impossible was just another word for what hadn't happened yet. And in the vast expanse of possibility that stretched ahead of humanity, guided by the principles learned on a desert ridge, everything was still waiting to happen. This story took countless hours to research and write perfectly. If you loved following Maria's incredible journey, please like this video, share it with others who appreciate amazing stories, and subscribe for more unbelievable true tales.